Thank you, Hilary. We have got some questions in, and also I wonder if you could sort of look at a couple of issues as well.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about when we hear about mass murder or massacres that border on the term of genocide.
Yeah.
But what about in the lead up, you know, before it escalates, when we're aware that things are happening, the steps to tyranny, the steps to genocide? I wonder if you could touch on that a bit and what we can do and how aware are we when things are going on. And the second point is more in terms of Brendan's point about, you know, mobilising people for Darfur. This question of them and us is often when we talk about a victim and a perpetrator, but there's also a them and us when you think about when people somehow, and Nick mentioned it as well, people who are far away, people who aren't, they're not like me, you know, they're a different colour skin, they've got a different way of life. How do we make what's going on around the world relevant to people so that therefore that can mobilise not only a sentiment, but that way it also can help justify when a government wants to make an intervention?
Yeah. The first question, early intervention. People talk about having better early warning systems. By and large, they're not that many conflicts that suddenly take the world by surprise, actually. And I don't really think that we want that. What we want for is the means to do anything about them, frankly. Now, if you think about the genocide in Rwanda, the truth is it didn't come from nowhere. It's not that suddenly people turned around one day and started murdering their neighbours. There had been a long period of time in which this ideology of hate had been nurtured, because there's really no other explanation as to why a neighbour should turn on neighbour, why the school teacher I heard describe what he did in a prison in Rwanda last week where he's being held, described in a rather matter-of-fact way how he killed 3 of his neighbours. Now he said because those in charge of the genocide said to him, if you don't do it, then we'll come in, we'll kill you, and then we'll kill them. And some people found themselves in that position. It's about taking an interest, actually, in other parts of the world and seeing that it is the right thing to do to try and intervene at an earlier stage to stop these things happening. It is about development. It is about giving people voice. It is about developing good governance. It's about democracy, giving people a chance to express a view, because that's how societies prosper. I think the second point you raised is for people just to hear the stories of those who are caught up in it. I mentioned the DRC, the Congo. Prior to the summer of 2003, if you'd asked most people in Britain, can you name the country in Africa where 3.5 million people have died in the last 10 years, I doubt if 1 in 100, let alone 1 in 200 people could have named correctly the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And then something happened. There was a film crew in Bunia, in Euston, DRC, and the Uruguayan peacekeepers were there, and they were attempting to shelter people from the rebels. And because of the coverage that got, Operation Artemis was launched, and the French sent some troops into Bunia, and we gave some technical assistance at the time, some backup. And the world's conscience was stirred. Now, it shouldn't have to wait for it to appear on our television screens for something to happen. But in my experience, the more people hear the stories and see what's going on, the more they realise that whatever the colour of our skin, the language we speak, the faith we profess, underneath we're all the same. We bleed, we cry, we have hopes for a better future. And when people understand that common humanity, then they're much more likely to say, yeah, go on, see what you can do to help.
Okay.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to bow to this
Okay,
point.
thank Pat for your contribution, and I'm also pleased to welcome Brian Brivati, Professor of Contemporary History and Human Rights at Kingston University. And without putting you on the spot, Brian, I wondered if maybe you had a question you wanted to pose to Hilary while he's with us.
Yes, I think so. I think one of the motivations behind the Euston Manifesto and what brought people together was a fear that post-Iraq, that moment of liberal interventionism that existed in the first and second Blair governments would somehow be swamped in the political fallout after the intervention. And I think that lots of people in Euston were in favour of the intervention, and lots of people were against the intervention in Iraq. What they shared was an idea of what you were just talking about, a sense of common humanity, that there were situations in the world that required intervention of both kinds. And I think we sometimes in these debates, because of Iraq, we spend a lot of time talking about the intervention part of that, and perhaps not enough time talking about the humanitarian part of that. So I suppose my question is whether the government remains committed to the principles that the Prime Minister has laid out in a series of speeches, and I suppose obviously what happens next, under new leadership, under new ownership. But secondly, that humanitarian part, because I think the moral, political dilemma we're at now is that, and with Somalia back very much as a source of conflict again, we see there is still, I think, a residual willingness, if we could have a clean intervention of some kind. When we go in, we go out, we stop the immediate killing, the troops come home, everybody gets the plaudits. The humanitarian part of it is that actually, we have to stay there for 10, sometimes 15 years in a post-conflict situation, where the commitment has to be long-term. And it's paradoxical, perhaps, to say this. But one of my slight fears, when I heard that al-Bashir has actually accepted the heavy support package, as I sort of spun that ahead in my head, okay, so let's say the 3,000 troops go in and the helicopters go in, and then over 4 or 5 months, then the 20,000 peacekeepers go in. It's after that, really, that I worry. I mean, it's going to be a big enough effort to get those peacekeepers in. Once they're in and the immediate killing is stopped, as you know better than I, that's the beginning of the problem, not the end of the problem. We then have 2 million people in IDP camps, maybe 1 million people outside of the reach of humanitarian agencies. The agencies themselves are terrified of operating in that country. It's incredibly difficult for them to operate. After we've moved off, after the immediate killing has stopped, the real horror can begin, and Congo is an illustration of that. So I suppose it's are we still committed to intervention, and if we are, what kind, and what's our long-term commitment on the humanitarian side in terms of reconstruction?
Well, do we remain committed? You bet we remain committed. Britain is the second largest giver of humanitarian assistance in the world. We've been the second largest humanitarian donor in Darfur, and the reason that the 2 million people are alive in the camps, and actually their conditions are better than they were 2.5 years ago, as the WHO mortality surveys have shown, is because of this enormous international humanitarian effort. And we will stick with it. But as I say to the Sudanese, I'd much, much, much rather spend the money on helping you to develop your country than keeping 2 million people in camps alive and another 1.5 million people who've been displaced elsewhere. And we absolutely are there for the long term. Similarly in Somalia, I went to Somalia for the day last summer in part to see the extraordinary people who have been running the UN relief operation in Najid, and that's before all of the recent events kicked off. It's a very, very difficult and a very dangerous place to work. It's had no proper governance for 15 years. 80% of children never seen the inside of a classroom. But we've stuck with that, and they have found, as humanitarian workers do, some of the most remarkable people I've ever met. They find a way of getting around the difficulties, the obstacles. They negotiate. They stand on principle. They are creative, and they get help to people who need it. And we absolutely will continue with that. The other thing I'd say about Darfur is, in the end, only politics is going to sort it. Now, it's a very complex conflict because it's about competition for land, it's about raw politics, it's about alienation, it's about the power being concentrated in the centre in Khartoum and the regions feeling forgotten. And yet, Sudan also provides an illustration of what you can do when you put your mind to it, and that's the North-South Peace Agreement. And one of the criticisms there was that somehow we paid, as a world, too much attention to the North-South peace deal and ignored Darfur. Well, I think the North-South peace deal was really important because it brought to an end Africa's longest-running civil war that claimed 2 million lives. So it shows what you can do, and the hybrid mission, the additional troops, all of which are needed, UN funding to pay for it, which I think is a really important innovation, with the first time assessed contributions have been used, is only a bigger, more effective sticking plaster on a wound. If you're going to heal the wound, you've got to have a political deal. And that's why bringing the parties together, the government, all of the rebel groups, and saying, what is it you want?